Welcome to Coffee with Joe for June 7th, 2010. It's a Monday. Joe, welcome.
Pete,
Uh,
thank you very much. Great to be here. Salute to you.
Joe, you talk about it as the great settling of accounts has yet to occur. What do you mean by that when you say the great settling of accounts?
Okay. Well, what I mean by that is simply this. It's like as if we need to have a either a chapter 11 or a chapter 13 filing for the national economies, okay? And when I say the national economies, there's the public sector and the private sector and the national economies. But the fact of the matter is, Pete, okay, that the system is broken. The debt money system of fractional reserve banking, creating money as debt, is a broken system. And if the system is broken and we need to get to a new system, and I always talk about, the exit strategy from the debt money system must include, you know, room for and, a substantial part of it being the great settlement of accounts. Well, most everybody would agree these days, Pete, that the amount of debt that's been created is unpayable. And if it's unpayable, what's going to happen? Stephen LeChance, says, cascading cross defaults. But cascading cross defaults just means, Pete, sorry, I'm not making that payment. Okay? I'm not making that payment. I'm defaulting on that. What's the remedy to the default? The remedy that's available to people that are holding the paper is very limited. Would tie up total international courts for a couple of generations to work out the losses that are necessary, Pete. Okay, so in my view, we can't have that, and we won't have that, and there's going to have to be something that takes place, and that's what I call the great settlement of accounts. Now, most of the unpayable debts, Pete, that are really unpayable debts, that are debts that have been unconscionably created, are in the structured investment vehicles that are created by the shadow bankers. And they are the shadow bankers to themselves are the counterparties to each other's holdings. Okay, so that's how they kind of built the house. They build the house of cards. And in order for us to ever get down to the point where we can transition to debt free money and replace debt money or bank credit money, debt money with real money, we need to have the transition to that through a settlement of all those debts. Now, who's capable of doing that? Only the governments are really capable of doing that, Pete. Okay? And you may recall Secretary Geithner in his very early last year, where he went to Congress and they were talking about, well, we're going to have to put in some reforms. And Geithner said, we want you to put in some reforms. Part of the reforms that we want you to put in is the enabling us, and that would be, remember, the Treasury, okay, enabling we the government, we the Treasury, uh, to settle. He actually called it restructuring, the restructuring of these financial institutions that they don't have the power to do right now, that they don't have the power to restructure them. So in other words, a finding of too big to fail. Okay, uh, one of the reasons that that's failed to move forward in the congressional legislation that's, by the way, this week being, hammered out, um, is because they can't agree, Pete, on what they would do about, Global Sachs, Goldman Sachs. Global Sachs is probably more accurate, uh, or any of those institutions in terms of trying to have them continue to exist in a world where they're actually, still providing for investment banking, and yet at the same time not threaten our commercial banking national economy. Okay, so if they're going to be able to do whatever they're going to do over there, we have to take the toxic assets, which is really what this is all about, Pete. It's the unpayable toxic assets that are now, because of the change to market accounting ruling for the banks and financial institutions, being carried on their books as if, in the real world, they could be settled. And in the real world, they can't be settled. And it's only because of the mark-to-market changes that we haven't seen the huge defaults. Because if we would have seen the huge defaults, we would be picking up the pieces of those institutions. And I say there's a way out of it, Pete. National governments, because they're responsible for their national economies, because they're responsible for the soundness of their currencies and the general well-being of their inhabitants and populace, have to be the ones that are a tool to do it. Now, having said that, all that is, Pete, is just a recognition that it's out there. Okay? It's a recognition that we've created unpayable debts. They cannot be repaid. They will not be repaid. And somebody's holding them, and we need to figure out a way to settle them. Now, they fall into a number of categories and types, Pete, okay, those structured investment vehicles. And, if we restored mark-to-market accounting and basically told every banker, every investment banker that's holding each of those types of vehicles, instruments, that they need to put them out on the market and see what they can get for them. Okay? And then establish the price of them. That would take care of a large part of it. Or, and this is really my preferred method of doing it, is to take one of the smaller financial institutions, a commercial bank that has an investment banking relationship, Pete, and when one of those fails, and you see that the reason that it failed is because it was holding mortgages that was backed by mortgage-backed securities, and the mortgages can't be repaid, and there's all these debt obligations to be paid, take that into receivership by the government. Again, it has one of each of those types of classifications, Pete. The government sells those on the open market. And nobody in their right mind is going to pay more than the market value of that, Pete, okay? And what that would do would be to establish the market value of that. Ensure anti-gaming, ensure no gaming of that auction, Pete. You'd be well on your way to defining the scale of the haircut that needs to be taken. Whoever's holding this much of this type of thing will mark it down to that in our economy. That's all we can do, Could happen globally, but I personally don't prefer that, Pete. I prefer national cooperation. That is to say, we would do it for our banks, and then let Canada do it for their banks, and Mexico do it for their banks, and those guys do it for their banks. Let each country do it for their banks, rather than trying to have the IMF, World Bank, it'd probably be the IMF, World Bank, do it. But at some point, Pete, either the whole thing will come crashing down, and to me, there's a great deal of unnecessary pain and suffering among real people out there in the world that will happen when it comes crashing down on its own. And I don't feel that's very far away. And I feel the best thing that we can do as part of our exit strategy, again, towards establishing a new money system, is to deal with the exit strategy from the debt money system. And that means these debt instruments that are out there have to be pared down, counted down to their true value, in order for that to go forward. Because then we can establish the relationship between the new money and the old money. We can't establish the relationship of the new money to the old money as long as there are these, extravagant casino type instruments out there that somebody can lay a claim with. We have to extinguish those claims.
Okay, Joe, that's a big piece there. We pretty much took up our 10 minutes,
Really? Sorry.
and gives us a lot to think about.
Okay.
All right.
Happy birthday, Pete.
Okay, thanks, Joe. See ya.
Ciao.